At dawn on October 26, 1942, the waters of the Santa Cruz Islands boiled with smoke and fire. Japanese dive bombers screamed downward through ragged cloud cover, their engines howling like banshees. Below, the massive silhouette of an American carrier, USS Hornet, was already burning, her deck shattered by armor-piercing bombs and suicide crashes. Sailors fought the flames with hoses and bare hands, while stretcher-bearers dragged the wounded through smoke-choked corridors. The Pacific War had become a war of attrition, and in that moment, Japan believed it had finally won another decisive blow. U.S. Navy After-Action Report, Oct. 1942. To the pilots in the cockpits of Mitsubishi A6M Zeros circling above, the picture seemed clear. Hornet was finished. Listing hard, engines dead, plumes of black smoke trailing into the sky, she looked like a coffin adrift on the waves. Radios crackled with victory cries. Japanese commanders on carriers like Shokaku and Zuikaku reported back to fleet headquarters. Another American flat-top destroyed. Their faith in the strategy of attrition, strike the carriers, bleed the U.S. Navy dry, appeared vindicated. Bundesarchiv Pilot Diary. Yet beneath the smoke and chaos, a mystery was already forming. In the days and weeks that followed, something would haunt the Japanese high command. Ships they swore were sunk would reappear. Steel hulls they believed broken beyond repair steamed back into battle. And names they thought erased from the war rosters, Enterprise, Yorktown, Hornet, kept resurfacing on intelligence reports. To Japan's warrior pilots, it seemed as if the American Navy had learned how to raise the dead. The phenomenon wasn't a trick of the eye, nor was it propaganda. It was real. It was industrial. It was relentless. American warships were being blasted, battered, and burned, but instead of vanishing forever, they returned again and again, patched up, refitted, and back in the fight weeks or even days later. The Japanese called it impossible. The Americans called it repair and logistics. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The seeds of this shock had been planted long before Pearl Harbor. By 1941, the U.S. Navy had developed a network of floating dry docks, repair ships, and forward bases across the Pacific. While Japanese naval doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, a single clash of fleets that would end the war, the Americans, guided by engineers, shipwrights, and logistical planners, were building a machine of endurance. In war, Japan aimed for knockouts. America prepared for marathons. Bureau of Ships Report, 1941. Still, in those desperate early months, the system seemed fragile. After Pearl Harbor, Japan had swept through Southeast Asia with terrifying speed. The Philippines fell. Singapore collapsed. Carrier strike forces roamed unchecked. At Coral Sea and Midway, the tide shifted, but it was far from secure. Each carrier mattered. Each cruiser and destroyer was precious. And every time one was hit, the question was the same. Could it be saved? When Yorktown was mauled at Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese intelligence listed her as sunk. Yet weeks later, as their carriers advanced toward Midway, they spotted her again. Battered, patched with steel plates and wooden scaffolding, she had limped into Pearl Harbor, been swarmed by thousands of shipyard workers, and rushed back to sea in just 72 hours. Naval Historical Center, Yorktown Damage Report, May 1942. To Japanese pilots who saw her rising again at Midway, it felt like a ghost ship had returned. This pattern repeated. At Santa Cruz, they thought Enterprise finished. Her flight deck ripped open, her elevators jammed. Crews buried their dead, and her damage report stretched pages long. But within days, welders and repair gangs were already crawling over her hull, patching her wounds while she remained at sea. She would reappear not months later but weeks, ready to launch aircraft once more. Bureau of Ships Field Report, Nov. 1942. The Japanese could not believe it. Their doctrine assumed that a ship knocked out of action would remain gone for months, if not permanently. Their own repair infrastructure was limited, often confined to yards back in Japan itself. A damaged carrier at the front was a cripple, a burden, and often scuttled rather than saved. But America treated damage as temporary. Flames could be smothered. Steel could be reforged. Engines could be replaced. Inside the command centers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, frustration mounted. Reports contradicted reality. A carrier listed as destroyed reappeared at the head of another task force. A cruiser assumed to be sunk turned up shelling beaches in the Solomons. Officers began muttering of American trickery, of inflated numbers, of some secret shipbuilding reserve that Japan could not match. Post-war interrogation report Tokyo 1946. For the men at sea, the effect was even more dramatic. Japanese pilots who had risked everything to dive through flak and flame, striking their bombs true, would later hear that their target still lived. It was demoralizing, as if their sacrifices meant nothing. Dramatized composite quote, "We watched her burning. We saw the explosions. Yet she came again." How can you kill an enemy who does not stay dead? The answer lay in America's ability to project not just power, but recovery. Mobile repair ships like USS Vestal and USS Prometheus accompanied fleets into forward waters. Floating dry docks were towed thousands of miles and anchored at island bases. Submarines could be patched at Midway, cruisers at Espiritu Santo, and carriers at Pearl. Behind every frontline task force, an invisible army of welders, machinists, pipefitters, and electricians stood ready to erase the damage of Japanese bombs. Bureau of Yards and Docks Report 1943. This system was not glamorous. It was not dramatic like dogfights over Guadalcanal or beach assaults at Tarawa, but it was decisive. For every ship Japan struck, America repaired two. For every sinking Japan declared, America raised another. The Pacific Ocean became not just a battlefield, but a conveyor belt of destruction and rebirth. By late 1942, Japanese pilots began whispering of it among themselves. Targets did not vanish, they multiplied. Each mission seemed harder than the last, because the same enemy they had already beaten rose to fight again. Their commanders demanded explanations, but none could be given. The American fleet, by all logic, should have been shrinking. Instead, it grew. The stage was set for a revelation that would forever change the balance of the Pacific War. The recognition that America's true weapon was not a single ship, nor a single battle, but an entire system of resilience. It was an industrial miracle hidden beneath the waves, and soon, in one decisive clash, that miracle would reveal itself in terrifying clarity, when Japanese crews saw with their own eyes that the ships they thought sunk had returned to haunt them once again. The shock was not a phantom. It had a name and it had steel behind it. The Americans called it the Service Squadron, a floating city of repair ships, dry docks, oilers, supply vessels, and engineering crews. It was the unsung arm of the fleet, commanded not by admirals in glory, but by logistics officers and naval engineers who understood that a damaged ship was not lost, only interrupted. Bureau of Ships Report 1943. To the Japanese, the discovery was baffling. Their doctrine had been built upon the teachings of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, that Japan's only chance lay in a crushing, decisive battle that would eliminate America's naval power in one stroke. This doctrine assumed that once sunk or crippled, American ships would take years to replace, the same as in Japan's own system. But Yamamoto and his staff had underestimated the invisible weapon America wielded, its capacity to repair, reinforce, and redeploy in time frames measured in weeks, not years. U.S. Naval War College Analysis. 1947. Take, for example, the floating dry dock ABSD-1, a titanic structure assembled in 1943. It stretched 927 feet long, capable of lifting battleships completely out of the water. It had its own cranes, workshops, and generators. When fully operational, it could raise a heavy cruiser within hours, allowing welders to crawl across its wounds while electricians rewired damaged systems. To Japanese observers, the concept was alien. To Americans, it was routine. Naval Construction Battalion Log, 1943. Even before these massive structures were complete, smaller mobile dry docks had already been deployed. Destroyers and submarines damaged in Solomon Islands clashes could be hauled out, patched, and sent back in days. One submarine commander recalled limping into Espiritu Santo with his bow shredded by depth charges, only to watch Seabees swarm over the hull and replate it in less than a week. "They sent us back to sea before the paint was even dry," he later wrote. Submarine Force Pacific War Diary, 1943. Contrast this with Japan. A damaged carrier often had to make the long journey back to Kure or Yokosuka, sometimes thousands of miles away. During the voyage, it risked submarine attack, fuel shortages, and further breakdowns. Once in port, The backlog of work, limited cranes, skilled workers stretched thin, meant weeks or months of inactivity. Japanese crews sometimes scuttled ships outright if they believed repairs were hopeless. America, by contrast, refused to let a ship die unless it had already sunk beneath the waves. Post-war Japanese naval analysis, 1946. This advantage came into terrifying focus during the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. On the night of November 13th, battleships Hiei and Kirishima clashed with U.S. cruisers and destroyers in a chaotic slugging match. Shells smashed through turrets, torpedoes ripped hulls, and fires raged uncontrolled. Hiei was finished, scuttled the next day after relentless air attacks. But ships like USS Portland, mauled and barely maneuverable, survived. Her stern was blown nearly off, one rudder jammed, her deck scarred. Yet she did not go home for burial. Instead, she went into a floating dock, her stern rebuilt, her hull reforged. Months later, she was back on patrol. U.S. Navy Damage Report, Deck 1942, Japanese intelligence tracked these comebacks with disbelief. Dramatized composite quote, "We counted them dead, yet they sail again." It is as if their factories are floating on the ocean itself. At the heart of this miracle were the engineers and technicians. Thousands of Seabees, the naval construction battalions, built bases and workshops on islands wrested from Japan. On Espiritu Santo, Noumea, and later Ulithi, entire repair depots sprang up. They had welding torches, machine shops, foundries, and spare parts flown in from California or built on site. They were the shadow warriors, hammering in the background while pilots and sailors fought in the spotlight. Without them, the myth of the resurrected fleet would have remained impossible. Naval Construction Battalion Report, 1944. The Japanese pilots felt this advantage in their bones during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944, what history would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. That day, hundreds of Japanese aircraft dove against U.S. carriers like Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown. Planes were shot down by the dozens. Bombs and torpedoes struck, setting some vessels afire. By nightfall, Japan had lost nearly 400 aircraft. But worse, the American ships, even those damaged, did not vanish. Crews fought fires, repair teams patched flight decks overnight, and by the next morning, aircraft were launching again. To Japanese survivors, it was supernatural. We struck them, yet they fought the next day as if nothing happened, one captured pilot confessed. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Interrogations of Japanese Officials, 1946. Technically, the explanation was straightforward. American carriers were designed with redundancy. Compartments were sealed, fire suppression was extensive, and repair crews were trained relentlessly in damage control. After the lessons of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy invested immense effort into training every sailor, not just to fight, but to repair. Buckets, hoses, cutting torches, welding rigs, they became weapons as critical as torpedoes. Damage Control Training Manual, 1942. One vivid example came when USS Franklin was struck in March 1945 off Japan's coast. Hundreds of sailors died, her decks a mass of fire and twisted steel. Yet her crew refused to abandon her. Damage control parties fought for hours, sealing compartments, cooling bombs, saving the ship against all odds. She should have been a tomb. Instead, she lived, towed home repaired, and later returned to service. To Japanese eyes, the fact that even Franklin survived was beyond comprehension. Franklin Damage Report, 1945. Behind the scenes, America's industrial base fed this cycle. Factories in California, Washington, and Virginia produced prefabricated hull plates, engines, and weapons. Spare parts were stockpiled in enormous depots and shipped forward. Engineers at General Electric supplied turbines. Welders in New Jersey built gun mounts. Shipwrights in Puget Sound crafted new flight decks. The front could consume ships, but the rear replaced them faster than the enemy could count. U.S. Maritime Commission Report, 1944. For the Japanese, the hidden advantage was psychological as much as material. Every time they believed they had destroyed an American task force, reality contradicted them. At Midway, Yorktown had returned from the dead. At Santa Cruz, Enterprise refused to die. At Leyte Gulf, carriers like Essex and Intrepid, struck again and again by kamikazes, kept launching aircraft the next day. It was as though America's fleet existed in two forms, the one Japan thought it had defeated and the one that actually kept fighting. Naval Analysis Division 1945, and in one battle after another, this illusion of invincibility grew. Every ship that came back magnified Japan's despair. Every ghost ship reappearance signaled that the war was slipping from their grasp. By late 1944, pilots who once dived with fanatical courage now did so with dread, knowing that even a successful strike might mean nothing. Their sacrifices were spent against an enemy that would not stay dead. It was in this crucible of fire, steel, and relentless repair that the balance of the Pacific turned. Japan's fleets bled out, while America's bled and healed. One side fought a war of attrition without replacements. The other fought with an industrial bloodstream that made resurrection possible. But the true impact of this hidden advantage was not just on the battlefield. It reshaped strategy, morale, and the psychology of war itself, tearing away Japan's confidence while hardening America's resolve into something unstoppable. And as the final years of the Pacific War loomed, that psychological edge would become the decisive weapon, leaving Japan's warriors staring across the waves at an enemy that seemed immortal. By the closing months of 1944, the legend of America's unsinkable fleet was no longer just a battlefield rumor. It had become a strategic reality. From the waters of the Philippines to the shadow of Iwo Jima, the Imperial Japanese Navy faced an opponent whose warships returned again and again, as if reborn from the sea itself. The shock that had first begun at Coral Sea and Midway now grew into despair. Japan's pilots went into combat believing that even if they succeeded, their efforts would be erased within weeks. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. Strategically, the implications were enormous. In naval warfare, the expectation was simple. Cripple the enemy fleet and the seas become yours. But the United States had flipped that assumption. With floating dry docks, repair ships, and an army of technicians deployed across the Pacific, crippling a ship only meant buying a few weeks at most. The Japanese Navy could not erase American ships fast enough. Their own losses, meanwhile, were permanent. Each carrier sunk at Midway, each battleship destroyed in the Solomons was gone forever. Japanese Naval General Staff War Diary 1944. This asymmetry transformed entire campaigns. During the grueling battles for the Philippines, kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at American carriers. Explosions lit the sea, fire consumed decks, and the reports came back to Tokyo declaring multiple carriers destroyed. Yet only days later, the same ships reappeared, patched, rearmed, and launching fresh waves of aircraft. For the kamikaze pilots who had given their lives, the effect was devastating. Their sacrifice achieved nothing lasting. Dramatized composite. If even death cannot stop them, then what are we dying for? Morale collapsed in ways that numbers alone could not capture. Japanese officers interrogated after the war admitted that the psychological burden of fighting an enemy who would not stay defeated weighed heavily on their pilots and crews. In contrast, the effect on American sailors was the opposite. The knowledge that their damaged ships would be saved, that repair crews would bring them home, hardened their resolve. They believed in their fleet's resilience, and that belief itself became a weapon. Interrogations of Japanese officials, 1946. The human cost of this miracle cannot be forgotten. In every fire-blackened corridor, repair gangs fought as fiercely as Marines storming a beach. Damage control was brutal, dirty, and lethal work, crawling into smoke-filled compartments, welding steel while flames raged inches away, cutting through twisted beams to rescue the trapped. Entire teams died in explosions as they tried to seal breaches or jettison torpedoes. Their victories were measured not in headlines, but in the survival of ships like Enterprise, Franklin, and Yorktown. Enterprise Damage Report 1942. Behind them stood the industrial workers, millions of welders, riveters, machinists, and electricians across America. Men and women in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle labored around the clock, forging steel plates, turbines, and weapons. The shipyards of Mare Island, Brooklyn, and Bremerton became the beating heart of the fleet. Their sweat and precision gave America something Japan could never match, not just ships, but the ability to bring them back from the edge of destruction. U.S. Maritime Commission Report 1944. This fusion of battlefield courage and industrial might created a feedback loop. A ship survived an attack. Repair crews restored it. Workers at home sent parts. The ship returned to battle, inspiring confidence among its crew. Each cycle magnified Allied momentum and drained Japanese will. By 1945, the Imperial Navy was a ghost of its former self, while America's Ghost Fleet kept multiplying. The psychological gap widened most clearly at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. Japanese planners believed their desperate gamble, throwing nearly every remaining ship into battle, might cripple America. Yet the U.S. fleet absorbed kamikaze strikes, shellfire and torpedo hits, only to keep advancing. Carriers like Intrepid and Franklin were struck again and again, but they remained afloat, their flight decks repaired enough to keep launching aircraft. Japan's last great fleet action ended in disaster. When survivors reached shore, they knew the truth. They had not destroyed the American fleet. They had only angered it. Naval Analysis Division, 1945. The resilience of America's ships also altered post-war doctrine. Naval strategists studied the lessons of floating logistics and forward repair and applied them to the Cold War. The concept of service squadrons evolved into permanent task forces, with nuclear-powered carriers sustained at sea for months by replenishment groups. In Korea, Vietnam, and later the Gulf War, the lesson echoed. The U.S. Navy's true strength was not just firepower, but its ability to endure damage and fight on. U.S. Naval War College, 1952. Technologically, the experience reshaped ship design. Redundant fire suppression systems, compartmentalization and modular repair became standard. Carriers like USS Nimitz, commissioned in the 1970s, bore the DNA of World War II's crucible, designed to survive hits and be repaired quickly. Every rivet carried the memory of sailors who had once fought with hoses and hammers to keep their ships alive. But perhaps the most enduring legacy was psychological. The Japanese Navy had entered the war believing in the power of decisive blows, of shattering the enemy's spirit with one crushing battle. America proved that wars are not decided by single strikes, but by endurance. In the words of one post-war American admiral dramatized, victory did not belong to the fleet that struck hardest. It belonged to the fleet that refused to stay broken. By the time the formal surrender came aboard USS Missouri in September 1945, the lesson was carved into history. The ships that had returned from the dead were anchored in Tokyo Bay, their scars still visible, their crews proud. For Japan's surviving officers, standing on Missouri's deck, the sight must have been haunting. Carriers they thought destroyed, cruisers they swore sunk, destroyers they had bombed and shelled, all stood assembled, alive and triumphant. U.S. Navy Log, Sept. 1945. This was the true weapon of the Pacific War, not a single torpedo nor any single ship, but the resilience of an entire system. Engineers, welders, machinists, and construction battalions had fought a war of endurance that matched the courage of sailors and Marines. Together they created the illusion of a fleet that could not die. In the end, the shock Japan's pilots felt was not superstition. It was the reality of industrial warfare. America had turned steel, sweat, and ingenuity into something greater than firepower, immortality at sea. And so the story closes with a universal truth, one not confined to the Pacific, but to every battlefield since, in modern war, the side that endures longer than the enemy does not merely survive, it wins.